The Amiga CD32 matters, and perhaps in 2025 more than ever. Back in 1993, Commodore promised the world a console that would set new standards for fans of electronic games. Those were the words of Lou Egebrecht, the company's vice president of engineering, spoken on the 16th of July 1993 during the CD32's official unveiling in London, and on paper, the company looked poised to do just that. Built around a CD-ROM technology equipped with more advanced graphics than its 16-bit rivals, and crucially arriving on shelves more than a year before the PlayStation or Saturn, the CD32 seemed ready to reclaim Commodore's once dominant place in the gaming landscape. Yet 3 decades later, the system isn't remembered as a trailblazer. More often it's treated as a punchline, overshadowed, overlooked and frequently dismissed entirely. It slipped quietly into obscurity while its competitors went on to shape the future of the industry. But in my opinion at least, that reputation deserves another look. I am Lady Arcade. If you like obscure retro gaming history, then hit subscribe, as today we're going to be taking a look at Commodore's final throw of the dice. We're going to look at the history of the Amiga CD32, why it failed, why it's possibly misunderstood, and whether after all these years it's finally worth your time. By the early 1990s, Commodore was running out of time. Once the undisputed champion of home computing, thanks to the runaway success of the original Amiga line, the company's fortunes had begun to crumble as the market evolved around it. The 16-bit consoles that had dominated the late 1980s were beginning to look dated. CD-ROM technology was rapidly emerging as the next frontier, and a new generation of competitors, many of them backed by deeper pockets and far larger marketing budgets, were preparing to enter the race. Commodore knew that if it didn't evolve quickly, it risked being left behind entirely. And so, in a move that reflected equal parts ambition and desperation, the company embarked on one of the fastest hardware development cycles in gaming history. Development began in late October of 1992, and by February of 1993, barely 4 months later, 15 prototypes had already been shipped. That breakneck pace wasn't born out of confidence, but sheer desperation. Commodore was scrambling to claw back its place in the living room, and it needed a new machine immediately. It was this urgency that influenced almost every decision Commodore made during the CD32's design. Cost, in particular, became a defining factor. One former Commodore insider explained to Retro Gamer that we had to have a price that was competitive with 16-bit technology today. The company simply couldn't afford to launch a premium-priced luxury console like the Neo Geo or 3DO. Instead, it needed to tempt players away from their Mega Drives and Super Nintendos with something that felt both affordable and distinctly next generation. A console that could stand toe-to-toe with the rising tide of 32-bit hardware, but without pricing itself out of reach. Developers too had a clear set of expectations for what Commodore's next console needed to be. The company's engineering team canvassed feedback from studios across Europe and North America, and the message that they received was refreshingly blunt. The new system had to focus on games, embrace CD technology, and deliver 32-bit power. It was a message the company took to heart. The CD32 couldn't afford to chase the same nebulous, interactive multimedia dreams that Philips and Panasonic were pursuing with the CDI and the 3DO. Instead, it needed to double down on what the Amiga had always excelled at, producing games that pushed the limits of graphics and sound while harnessing the vast storage capacity and audio capabilities of CD-ROM. Codenamed Spellbound during development, the project was positioned internally as nothing less than Commodore's redemption story, a modern, forward-looking console that would carry the company's pioneering spirit into a new era of gaming. But beneath the confident marketing rhetoric, there was an unmistakable sense of unease. The development schedule was brutally tight, resources were stretched to their limits, and Commodore's financial position was, by this point, deteriorating rapidly. This wasn't so much just a race to beat Sony and Sega to the market, it was a race against insolvency itself. Despite that pressure, the CD32 was far from a hastily assembled stopgap. Commodore's engineers knew that simply bolting a CD drive onto the Amiga 1200 wouldn't be enough. To compete in the rapidly approaching 32-bit era, the hardware needed genuine architectural evolution. The result was a system that combined familiar elements of the Amiga platform with new components designed to push it forward, even if the final execution sometimes struggled to match the ambition. At its core, the CD32 was powered by Motorola's 68EC020 processor, a cost-reduced version of the 68020 running at 14.28 MHz. This, paired with 2 MB of chip RAM and the advanced graphics architecture chipset, represented a significant improvement over the older 68,000-based Amigas of the previous generation. The AGA chipset itself was more evolutionary rather than revolutionary. It was capable of outputting 256 colours from a 24-bit palette and supported resolutions up to 1280 by 512. On paper, these were strong specifications, and in 1993 they were competitive, but with true 3D-focused systems like the PlayStation and Saturn already on the horizon, they were beginning to look outdated before the CD32 even hit store shelves. What truly set the CD32 apart, though, was the introduction of a custom component known as a Keyco, a single chip that streamlined the console's internals by consolidating several functions that had previously required multiple discrete components. As Commodore's own technical documentation explained, a Keyco is responsible for implementing system glue logic that, in previous Amiga models, were found in the discrete chips Budgie, Gale, and the two CIAs. This consolidation reduced manufacturing costs and simplified the overall design, but a Keyco's most significant contribution lay elsewhere. You see, the Amiga's legacy was built around planar graphics, a memory-efficient method of storing image data that had served the platform well throughout the 1980s, but by the early 1990s, most developers were working with chunky pixel rendering, which offered more direct access to individual pixels and was far better suited to the richer visuals and larger assets of the CD-ROM era. A Keyco attempted to bridge this growing gap with a built-in chunky-to-planar C2P conversion system. As Commodore's engineers described it, the conversion works by writing 32 8-bit chunky pixels into a Keyco's registers and reading back 8 32-bit words of converted planar data. In theory, this process offloaded a significant amount of graphical work from the CPU, improving performance without sacrificing compatibility with the Amiga's existing display pipeline. In practice, however, the results were mixed. While Keyco's C2P hardware was a clever solution to a long-standing limitation, its benefits were constrained by the system's overall architecture. Amiga Formats reported that a Keyco C2P is outperformed in software as soon as you get fast RAM, even with an EC020 at 14.28 MHz. That single observation summed up the CD32's central paradox perfectly. It was a system packed with smart ideas and forward-thinking engineering, but many of those ideas were ultimately blunted by tight budgets, legacy design decisions, and the sheer speed at which the machine had been rushed to market. Even so, the CD32 was a surprisingly elegant machine in many respects. It shipped with region-free functionality, meaning any PAL or NTSC disk could run on the hardware as long as the connected display supported the output, a rare feature in 1993. It also offered both PAL and NTSC video output options by default, and even included a boot menu that allowed users to adjust system settings on the fly, small quality-of-life touches that reflected Commodore's deep understanding of its audience. The result was a console that, while never the most powerful of its generation or the easiest to develop for, occupied a unique space in gaming history, a bridge between two eras, the final breath of the classic Amiga lineage, and an early glimpse of the multimedia future that would define the decades ahead. If the hardware told a story of rushed brilliance, the software library revealed the consequences of that rush even more clearly. The CD32's games were an unpredictable mix of promise, potential, and puzzling decisions, from genuinely forward-thinking showcases of the CD-ROM format to bare minimum ports that barely justified their existence. And yet, that inconsistency is precisely what makes the library so fascinating to revisit today. It represents a snapshot of an industry in transition as developers learned how to harness the power of optical storage and experimented with what it could make possible. Some of the system's best titles remain impressive even now. Games Radar reported that Flink, for instance, made full, unabashed use of the monumental storage space available on these new-fangled CD-ROMs. Its lavish animation, rich soundtrack and sprawling level design went far beyond what was possible on cartridge-based hardware and stood as one of the few games on the system that truly felt like a generational leap forward. The point-and-click adventure Simon the Sorcerer also demonstrated the potential of the format. Rather than a straightforward port, it was enhanced with full voice acting, including narration by Red Dwarf actor Chris Barry, a performance that contemporary critics described as a revelation that sets high standards for other companies to follow. Shooters were another genre in which the CD32 occasionally punched well above its weight. Banshee, an original vertical scrolling shooter, was praised at the time for its punishing difficulty, fluid controls and stunning visuals. Reviews described it as a tough-as-nails shooter and one of the Amiga's best shmups, and it remains a collector favourite to this very day, a textbook example of what could be achieved when developers fully embraced the hardware rather than treating it as an afterthought. But for every ambitious title like Flink or Banshee, there were just as many that squandered the platform's potential. Many games were barely distinguishable from their floppy disk predecessors, often adding little more than CD quality audio or a perfunctory FMV intro. Others were straightforward ports released with minimal optimization, while some shipped with puzzling design limitations that exposed just how rushed many development schedules had been. This inconsistency wasn't simply a byproduct of time pressure either, it was also a consequence of Commodore's lack of strategic direction. Developers were often given little guidance or technical support, and many were forced to work within severe hardware constraints. As former developer Aaron Fothergill later reflected, by the time they did the CD32, they really didn't have a clue. It only had 1K of flash storage to save all your games. That cost-cutting decision meant proper save functionality was essentially impossible, forcing studios to fall back on cumbersome password systems or omit saving entirely, a frustrating limitation at a time when battery-backed memory had become standard on rival consoles. The result was a library that often felt like two entirely different consoles coexisting uneasily within the same plastic shell. On one side, some titles embraced the CD format and pushed the Amiga's hardware to its limits, offering glimpses of what a truly supported CD32 ecosystem might have achieved. On the other hand, there was a glut of hastily repackaged ports, low-effort shovelware, and half-baked curiosities that felt more like relics of the previous generation than products of a bold new era. But at the same time, for many, it's this strange duality that makes exploring the CD32's catalogue so compelling today. The truth is, you're just as likely to stumble upon a hidden gem that still feels fresh and ambitious as you are to encounter something unfinished, misguided, or outright baffling. That unevenness undoubtedly contributed to the console's commercial struggles, but also gives the system an unpredictable charm, a snapshot of a rapidly evolving industry grappling with the opportunities and growing pains of an unfamiliar technological frontier. Yet, for all its technical promise and occasional flashes of brilliance, the Amiga CD32 was never able to fulfill the role Commodore had envisioned for it. The reasons read like a checklist of corporate missteps, unfortunate timing, and bad luck. Some of those failures were self-inflicted, while others were entirely beyond the company's control, but together they created a perfect storm that doomed the console before it ever had a real chance to succeed. So let's break down how it all began to go so horribly wrong. The first and most devastating blow came from outside the company. Just as the Commodore was preparing to launch the CD32 in North America, a crucial step if it was to compete with Sega, Nintendo and the soon-to-arrive PlayStation, it was blindsided by a long-running legal dispute. The company had been locked in a bitter battle with CAD Trug over US Patent 4197590, which covered XOR cursor technology used in Commodore's machines. The case had dragged on for years, but as the CD32 approached its US launch window, the courts finally ruled against Commodore. Amiga World reported that a deadline was reached for Commodore to pay $10 million in patent royalty, and a federal judge ordered an injunction preventing it from importing anything into the United States. The impact was catastrophic. The United States was the single largest console market in the world, and without access to it, the CD32 was effectively crippled before it could even compete. Shipments were blocked at customs, retail launches were cancelled, and marketing campaigns were abruptly shelved. For a company already teetering on the edge of financial collapse, the loss of the American market was a fatal blow. Within months, Commodore's cash flow evaporated, and by April of 1994, less than a year after the CD32's European debut, the company had filed for bankruptcy. What an absolute nightmare. So this raises the question, could history have been different? Well, I think the likely truth is that even without the legal disaster that crippled its North American ambitions, the CD32 would still have faced significant challenges. Chief among them was the perception of its software library. As the Oasis BBS later remarked, few titles utilise the CD medium to its fullest potential. Most were simply repackaged Amiga 1000 era titles. Now, this sentiment became widespread and deeply damaging. To many early adopters, the CD32 felt less like a bold leap forward and more like a glorified Amiga 1200 with a disk drive attached. Without a wealth of groundbreaking software to showcase the benefits of the new hardware, it was difficult for Commodore to convince players that the console justified its price tag, and that sense of déjà vu left many consumers distinctly underwhelmed. Compounding this problem was the near-total absence of exclusives, the lifeblood of any successful console ecosystem. The vast majority of releases were either straight ports or lightly enhanced versions of games already available on standard Amiga hardware, leaving existing Amiga owners with little reason to invest in the new system. This situation was worsened by the console's extremely short lifespan, which made third-party developers hesitant to commit resources to a platform that might not even exist 12 months later. Hardware limitations added yet another layer of difficulty: the absence of built-in storage for save data, a glaring omission in the mid-1990s, and its reliance on a predominantly 2D-focused architecture at a time when the industry was beginning to pivot decisively towards 3D rendered it out of step with market expectations, while its continued dependence on the aging Amiga chipset only reinforced the impression that this was only a stopgap solution rather than a truly next-generation console. These technical shortcomings, combined with the weak software lineup and disastrous legal circumstances, created a perfect storm from which the CD32 could never realistically recover. In the end, the system's downfall was never the result of one fatal flaw, it was a cascade of interconnected problems. Commodore's precarious financial state meant it couldn't absorb the shock of the CAD-truck injunction. Its rushed development cycle left it with hardware that was competent but unremarkable, and its software support, arguably the single most important factor in the success of any console, never reached the critical mass required to sustain long-term momentum. The tragedy is that none of these issues were insurmountable in isolation. With deeper pockets, more development time, or a stronger launch lineup, the CD32 might have carved out a viable niche for itself as a mid-tier alternative to the console heavyweights of the fifth generation. Instead, it became a cautionary tale, a system that promised much, delivered too little, and vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. Yet, for a console that disappeared from store shelves in less than a year, the CD32 has enjoyed an extraordinary afterlife. Commodore's bankruptcy in April of 1994 might have marked the end of its commercial relevance, but it did little to extinguish the passion of a dedicated community of fans, collectors and developers who have spent the decades since ensuring the system remains alive. In fact, in many ways, the CD32 is now more accessible, more versatile and more enjoyable to use than it ever was during its original lifespan. One of the key reasons for that survival is the work of preservationists who recognised the machine's historical value early on. As Amiga Format reported, over the years, the Aminet and English Amiga board communities have preserved the CD32's Kickstart ROMs and disk images. Their efforts ensured that the console's software library, once at risk from corporate collapse, disk rot and failing hardware, remained easily available to anyone curious enough to explore it. Modern emulators such as WinUAE, PUAE and Amiberry now reproduce the CD32 experience with remarkable accuracy, adding modern conveniences like enhanced resolution, save states and controller mapping that make revisiting its catalogue smoother and more enjoyable than ever before. But as cool as this is, emulation is only part of the story. Many enthusiasts have gone further still, breathing new life into the original hardware itself. One of the most significant breakthroughs has been the rise of WHD Load, a tool that allows games to be installed directly onto modern storage devices rather than read from aging optical media. As a contributor on the English Amiga board explained, WHD load slaves running from IDE or SD eliminates the need for fragile CD drives and preserve original discs for posterity. This approach not only protects valuable physical media from wear, but also dramatically improves loading times and reliability, addressing one of the most persistent frustrations of using 1990s hardware today. Hardware modifications have pushed the system even further beyond its original capabilities. One of the most popular upgrades is the Terrible Fire TF330, a third-party expansion that replaces the CD32's stock internals with significantly more powerful components. As Retro Revival noted, the TF330 converts your CD32 into a souped-up Amiga 1200 with a built-in CD-ROM drive, effectively transforming the console from a modest games machine into a versatile Amiga computer capable of running a far broader range of software. Additional aftermarket enhancements from IndieVision AGA Mark III HDMI output boards and Pi0 RGB to HDMI converters to internal SD card adapters, RAM expansions and optical drive emulators have made the CD32 not just viable but genuinely practical in the modern era. Even niche accessories such as wireless controller adapters and 3D printed replacement shells demonstrate the depth of affection this 30-year-old machine continues to inspire among its fanbase. Then there's the thriving homebrew scene, which is perhaps the clearest evidence of the CD32's enduring appeal. Over the last 2 decades, dedicated fans have produced a steady stream of new games, demos, and ports that push the hardware far beyond anything Commodore's engineers could have envisioned in 1993. These creations have turned what was once considered a failed platform into an active, evolving part of retro gaming culture. Standout examples include Bombjack Beer Edition, Rygar AGA, Turbo Sprint, and Devil's Temple, each of which demonstrates how much untapped potential still exists within the hardware. In many ways, the CD32's modern renaissance is the ultimate irony. Once dismissed as a commercial failure and a symbol of Commodore's decline, it has since become a beloved playground for enthusiasts, a piece of retro hardware that thrives not because of corporate backing, but because of the dedication of the people who refuse to forget it. Today, the CD32 is no longer just a historical curiosity, it's a living part of retro gaming culture, preserved, enhanced, and continually reimagined by the community that loves it most. For decades, the system was written off as a technological dead end, but like so many misunderstood consoles, time has softened that harsh verdict. With distance and thanks to the passion of a dedicated fanbase, the CD32's reputation is undergoing a quiet but meaningful reassessment. What was once seen purely as a failed experiment is increasingly recognised as an important stepping stone, a machine that's pointed towards the future even if it never quite reached it. We live in a different world now. Modern hardware solutions and preservation projects have stripped away many of the frustrations that once defined it. Emulators now deliver pixel-perfect performance without mechanical failures or lengthy load times, while optical drive emulators make accessing software virtually instantaneous. WHD load installations, meanwhile, have transformed once delicate discs into robust digital libraries. Together, these innovations have allowed the CD32 to step out from under the shadow of its troubled past and finally be appreciated on its own merits. With such a revival, there has been a shift in how the CD32 is discussed. As of today, the CD32's legacy is no longer about what it failed to achieve. It's about what it represents, a bold attempt to anticipate the future of an industry still trying to define itself. The fact that it stumbled commercially doesn't diminish its importance. If anything, it makes the machine more compelling because, as history has repeatedly shown, The consoles that fall short often reveal the most about where gaming was heading, and in the case of the Amiga CD32, that future, once obscured by failure, now looks clearer and more relevant than ever. It was never the most powerful console of its era, it wasn't the most commercially successful, but the most historically celebrated or even the most fondly remembered. But for those willing to look past its flaws, the CD32 offers something rare, a direct, unfiltered connection to one of the most ambitious and fascinating chapters in gaming history. In many ways, it's best understood not as a rival to the PlayStation or Saturn, but as a time capsule, a snapshot of a pivotal moment when the industry was still feeling its way into the future. The quirks, compromises and rough edges all tell a story of a company pushing beyond its means, of bold ideas colliding with harsh realities, and of technology that was simultaneously ahead of its time and already obsolete. So, should you play the Amiga CD32 in 2025? The answer depends entirely on what you're looking for. If you're a collector, it's an essential piece of 1990s gaming history, distinctive, unusual, and packed with stories that go far beyond the games themselves. If you're an enthusiast, it's a rewarding platform to explore, filled with curiosities, hidden gems, and technical experiments that still feel fresh decades later. And if you're a part of the homebrew or preservation scene, it's a thriving playground, a platform where passionate creators continue to push the hardware in ways Commodore never could. Even for casual retro gamers, there's a compelling case to give it a try. Emulation today is virtually flawless. FPGA recreations are more accessible than ever, and original hardware is easier to maintain thanks to a wealth of modern upgrades. Experiencing the CD32 no longer demands the patience or the budget that it once did. Instead, it offers the opportunity to examine a bold, flawed era in its purest form and to appreciate the ambition that fueled it. The Amiga CD32 was never destined to dominate the market, and it never did, but 3 decades on, that no longer matters. What does matter is that it still has something meaningful to offer, a distinctive perspective on the evolution of gaming, a catalogue that rewards curiosity, and a legacy that is finally being appreciated on its own terms. In a landscape where so much of gaming history has been lost to time, that alone makes it worth revisiting and perhaps worth falling in love with all over again. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, give the channel a boost by subscribing, dropping a like and leaving a comment to help with engagement. And while you're here, why not check out my video on the often misunderstood 3DO console.